Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I am Matthew Lucas, and we post every Friday, so do hit subscribe if you want to watch our continuing horticultural adventures.
And don't forget that we also do shorts on a Monday, so if you've got a burning horticultural question you need the answer to, put it in the comments below and we will hopefully get round to answering it for you in 60 seconds.
And I wish it was burning today, Stephen. Let's just say it's midwinter.
Yes, it's still cold, it's midwinter, but we're at least not in the Arctic.
Well, true. Small blessings.
Yeah.
Now, remember, every plant that we mention in this video is in the copy below. So if you don't see the names, just click read more and you'll see all the lists below.
Yes, and today's
Yes.
topic, we're going to talk about some plants that you can put with your woodland conditions. So
Yep.
somewhere where you've got a woodlandy type garden,
Yep.
you tend to find a lot of the plants in that sort of aspect tend to be herbaceous. So they
Yep.
disappear. Some of them are quite ephemeral, in fact, that they come up, do their thing and disappear very quickly. And you often end up with rather large bare patches.
Which we don't love, Stephen.
No, we don't love. So we're going to look at a range of evergreen or winter stimulated plants, things that come up during the colder months of the year that will take the place of your trilliums and your other woodland plants when they're down. So
Aha.
that's the plan today, is to look at some of those plants and give you a little inspiration so that you don't end up with huge big bare patches around the garden.
So what we're looking at is winter shade ground cover foliage.
Yes, basically, yes. So it's a fairly specific topic today, but nonetheless, I mean, lots of people want to grow those woodlandy plants. They find that when they do, that the garden just lacks some oomph for a good percentage of the year.
Yeah.
So you do need those plants that will take over. I mean, when a hosta dies down, it leaves a huge big patch. Lots of other things will do exactly the same thing. So we're just going to look at some of those plants that will give you some winter interest.
Okay, well, let's go.
All right, what a good idea. Where do we start? Hellebores over the last few decades have changed remarkably. They used to be these sort of pale pink, greenish and whitish things of usefulness in the garden, but not stunningness, unfortunately. But now with the breeding programs that are going on, there's all sorts of fabulous forms and shapes. So here I've got an anemone scented one. Over there's a single one with a slight picketed edge on them. I've got a white one down there. And what I've tried to do here is stick with one sort of colour, sort of toning. So it's all about pink and white in this part of the garden, which also, of course, helps with the Daphne Ballua in flower behind me. So they are really fabulous plants, and they're also really good for their foliage as well. So in your woodland garden, I guess they are almost de rigueur. You just can't live without having some hellebores. Now, hellebores are basically evergreen perennials. It's a good idea to take the old leaves off them in the autumn before they start to come up into flower, which unfortunately I didn't get round to this year because I was away overseas, but anyhow. So they are a little bit on the low side in the autumn because you've just taken all the old leaves off, but they're about to shoot again, and that's when they come up into flower. So these will flower right through until early spring. Then if you don't want seed to form, you cut the flower heads off before they go to seed, because you will get variation from seedlings coming up around your stunning and expensive hellebores. So I generally cut the flower heads off. And then you've got the nice, handsome, leathery foliage, which will be a good foil for your hostas and your trilliums and all of those other lovely woodland plants, the Solomon seals, all those things that you want to have in your woodland that are things that disappear. Well, this has to be one of my favourite evergreen plants for a woodland condition. It's a plant called Danae racemosa, and it's commonly known as Alexandrian laurel. And in fact, it was actually the plant that was used to make laurel wreaths on which you would put on the heads of Olympic athletes. I could never work out how you could make a laurel wreath that didn't take their heads off or stick in their ears, but this is lovely and supple, and I can understand why they would have used it for that. It's in the asparagus family, makes a nice arching evergreen mound of foliage. It gets little white flowers in clusters on the ends of the stems, and after the flowers are finished, I've got a couple of berries that are formed on this one. It hasn't flowered very well the previous year, but it's really about its shape, its form, its texture, and its evergreenness that is really the important bit. The little white flowers and the red berries are a charming addition, but it's really about its form and shape that you grow Danae. And it will grow in the darkest and possibly driest shade you can find in the garden. So what more could you want? Now, it comes from the mountains of the Mediterranean region. Obviously, it needs to if they'd used it for Olympic athletes way back when. So it will cope with dry, hot summers as long as it's in the shade. It will cope with cold winters. So frost and snow are generally not a problem for it. So it's a remarkably tough plant that would grow in most climatic zones, as long as you keep it out of the sun and probably out of the tropics, because it likes that Mediterranean-y climate.
All right, Stephen. Now, this leaps out at me because these leaves look like they're an aquatic plant. What is this?
It does. It's commonly known as a dawn poppy, Eomecon, which means eastern poppy, chionantha meaning snowy white, right. And it's an evergreen perennial. Obviously comes from Asia. It has this beautiful soft green, almost water lily pad-like leaf.
Yeah.
And the leaves sit at all sorts of different heights and forms. So. Yeah. For me, I like the way it sort of sits texturally in the garden, and I just happened to prepare one earlier. Here we have one with some flowers on. Now, this doesn't have a massive flowering season, as in it all comes out at once. This will throw up flowers off and on almost throughout the year. So although my patch hasn't got any flowers on at the moment, I have got some in pots that are in fact in bloom, and this could be in flower now, but it will have just odd sprays of the little white poppy flowers on it pretty well all throughout the year.
Well, it's really beautiful. I love the shape of the leaf. So, obviously, shade, but is this more of a moisture lover?
Yes. If Eomecon gets too dry in the summer, it will die right down. And if it stays too dry, it will actually die out. So it does like to have a permanently moist aspect to grow well. And if it's got good soil and a moist aspect, in some people's gardens, it almost becomes a bit of a thug.
Now, is it rhizomas or is it just a plant?
Yeah, no, it has
a rooty plant.
It has a creeping rhizome that grows under the ground, not normally terribly deeply, but the rhizome is quite fragile. So if you're trying to get it out, you tend to break bits off all the time. And of course, any bit you leave behind is likely to come up again.
Right.
So I guess if you've got really leafy, rich, moist soil somewhere, you might have to think through whether Eomecon is for you, just in case it becomes a thug. But it is a beautiful plant, and here it struggles through my summers, so I have to keep it fairly well watered. I don't think it's ever going to become a pest, and other things seem to be able to come through it, so it doesn't sort of swamp or smother other plants. So I've had trilliums come up through it, I've had all sorts of other things grow through it, and yes, although it can take off a bit, it doesn't seem to be an issue in the garden for me.
Fantastic. All right, well, I love this, and I'm thinking, that might be great in a pot in our shady courtyard. On to the next.
Yes. Well, what's in front of us are a couple of really interesting ground covers for shade.
I'm going to go get leaves. You keep talking.
All right, I will. One of them is from Turkey and the Caucasus, and it's a plant called Pachyphragma macrophylla. And apparently Pachyphragma means thick shield or screen, which in fact alludes apparently to something to do with the seed pod, so it's not very descriptive. Macrophylla means big leaf.
Hang on, which one? This one?
No, that one.
That one.
That one.
There
So its leaves are slightly more sort of veined and slightly more serrated around the edge, and it gets these gorgeous little white flowers, and it's in the same family as your cabbages and mustard and
well, actually, you can see that in the flower.
Yeah, and the flowers are edible.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry,
not particularly. You can if you wish. You'll probably not find it overly exciting, but anyhow.
Nothing. Now, we cunningly took some footage of this in summer when it was in full bloom, looking gorgeous.
Well, I would have said late spring, but anyhow, close enough.
We'll drop that in now.
So you get this carpet of white when it's in flower. It's more or less evergreen. It's not stoloniferous or rhizominous. It's actually a self-seeding clumping perennial, but you get still a lovely drift of it when you plant it out and let it self-seed.
Yeah.
And of course, because it's a self-seeder, it's comparatively easy to manage. So if something comes up where you don't want it, you can whip it out and just keep it in a restricted area. And again, other things will come through it. I've got cobra lilies that come up through this batch of Pachyphragma, and it looks fantastic.
So we know where it's from,
Yeah.
and obviously it likes shade, but what about the moisture?
It's not as water hungry as some, so it can be allowed to dry out a little bit. I certainly don't have to give my plants any added irrigation where they are,
Yeah.
although this is probably one of the dampest and moistest spots in my whole garden. But nonetheless, it can get dry in the summer when the roots of the trees above suck up a fair bit of moisture. The Pachyphragma just laughs it off.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now, its neighbour
Yes.
growing next to it is this, which is...
This is commonly known as wild ginger,
Yep.
although it's not related to ginger, but if you pull it out of the ground, the smell of the roots have a gingery smell.
Oh,
So
right.
that's where the common name comes from. Asarum, and this, in the case of this one, it's Asarum caudatum, and it's all about its leaves. It makes a mat across the ground. It has a creeping stolon that runs across the surface.
Stolen.
Stolons tend to run across the surface, rhizomes tend to run under.
Ah, there you go.
There's
Now
a
we
vague
know.
description to tell you what they do.
Yes.
There are some crossovers, by the way, but anyhow, that's the basics.
Yeah.
Now, the flower on this looks like a brown or green starfish.
Yes.
And it sits under the leaves.
And it so happens that I have one in a pot which is flowered, and I think I've got a photograph, so I'll drop
Yeah.
the picture in.
Well,
It's
if
a
you
beau-
haven't, I'll send you one,
No.
Matthew.
It's a beautiful flower, but hard to see.
Yeah, well, and it's not really the point. It's the fact that it gives you this good evergreen
Yeah.
foliage. Now, not all Asarums are evergreen. Some species are completely herbaceous in the winter.
Yeah.
But in the case of this one, it is definitely an evergreen species. It will make quite large pads. It also self-seeds as well in amongst itself, so I find it moves around a bit. But because it tends to run over the surface, I just go around with a sharp spade and cut the edges off if it comes out too far over the path
Right.
or wherever.
And so where is this from?
Well, the Asarums are interesting because they come from both Asia and North America,
Yeah.
different species, obviously. As far as I know, caudatum, I think, is an Asian species. You've actually caught me on the hop there. I'd have to look it up.
Well, let's
Yeah.
see. Now, it's growing cheek by jowl with its friend here
Yeah.
from the Mediterranean.
Yes.
So obviously it likes the same conditions.
Oh yeah, yes. It's fairly drought tolerant in the summer,
Yeah.
although it doesn't like to dry right out.
Yeah.
It's cold hardy, so it doesn't seem to be perturbed by frosts and things. And there's something rather fun about it. The fact that the flowers are hidden. It's quite nice to go hunting, and because they're strange starfishy looking things, it's almost like waiting for that nasty piece of a horror movie to come along. They really
And
are weird.
They look a little bit like, is it Sepelia? That
Yeah,
succulent.
in that sort of vein.
It looks like it would smell horribly and be pollinated by flies.
Yeah, well, in fact, the Asarums don't seem to have any particular scent to them, but there is a rumour that they might be pollinated by slugs.
Oh!
Of all things.
Well, I would have thought the leaf was very slug edible. So
Yeah,
there you
they
are.
don't seem to bother it terribly much. And just in passing, I might add that it's used in Chinese medicine as well.
I really want to know how a slug could pollinate something. I mean,
Well,
it
if the
just
flower
drags-
sits at ground level, it can crawl straight into the flower. That's why the flowers sit under the leaves.
Okay, but
So-
but it's got to transfer the pollen.
well, that's all right. It's slimy, so the pollen would stick to it.
Okay.
I mean, this could be a whole load of nonsense. I've just read somewhere that somebody once said that they thought they were slug pollinated. It could be completely wrong.
Okay, well, I'm not loving the idea of slug slime dragging pollen through, tiptoeing through the tulips, as it were. All right, but I think there's something else for us to go and look at.
Oh yes, there's several more things to look at, but let's go and look at another one now.
Okay.
All right, I hesitate to talk about this group of plants because I know that there's people out there that have an absolute hate for the true arums. But arums can be very useful, especially if you're using the less viciously spreading varieties for their winter effect in the garden. And here we've got two different ones growing in one of my woodland areas. This one in the front of me with its magnificent marbled leaves, I actually imported years ago from America, and it's Arum italicum White Winter, and I think it is the most stunningly beautiful plant, and it doesn't seem to have the same propensity to self-seed itself that straight Arum italicum does. And the other arum behind me here with the plain green leaf, which I think is rather gorgeous as well, is one of the Mediterranean species, Arum cyrenaicum. I think I got the pronunciation right on that. And it gets a strange sort of plum-coloured flower on it later in the season as it's about to die down. And it also self-seeds, but not madly. So I find both of these reasonably well behaved, at least in my garden. And they do exactly what I want, and that is give me interesting textural and colourful foliage right through the winter months. They just promptly disappear when the heat comes on, so they don't care how hot and dry it gets in the summer. They seem to cope with any amount of cold, so they don't seem to be a problem in cold climates. So one could almost say that they're almost too easy to grow. And of course, if you get excited by arums, we actually did do a whole story on the genus. So we'll link that below so you can have a look at our story on the whole group. Well, Matthew, we're now plonked in the middle of another part of my garden.
This is seriously woodlandy, Stephen.
Yes,
we are squatting.
Yeah, we're squatting in amongst other things. But the plant I wanted to engage with
Yeah.
is this strappy leaf number here. And many people will be familiar with this as an almost garden weed, and that's Iris foetidissima. It's an evergreen iris, comes from all through Europe and England and all over the place.
Yeah.
It is virtually indestructible. It self-seeds itself quite vigorously. And the main reason I wanted to engage with it is that it gives a strappy foliage form that can be quite useful in your woodlandy areas, just to give a variation from those larger, rounder, platy leaves. And it's a matter of just management. I mean, it's easy to pull out when it's small.
Yeah.
So if it comes up in far too big a quantity. The flowers are small and sort of a buffy cream colour with brownish veins in them, so not overly showy. It does get spectacular big green seed pods that split open with orange seeds inside.
Yes.
And that happens in the autumn. So it's doing things throughout the year, but it's about the fact that it will grow in dry, dark shade, give you lovely, strappy, dark green evergreen foliage, and is yet another good component for that woodland area where you need evergreenness.
And an interesting niche, because most irises are sun lovers. It's managed to evolve itself into a unique posse as an iris.
Yes, now I just wanted to point out in passing, you of course know what foetidissima means.
Smelly.
Smelly, yes. And in fact, one of its common names is the stinking gladwin, and another one is beefsteak plant. And all those names allude to the smell of the roots.
Oh, not the flower.
No. So you're not going to be knocked over as you walk out into the garden by the pong of your stinking gladwin. But
I wonder who Gladwin was.
Yeah, I have no idea where that comes from. But anyhow, it has a whole range of common names.
Yeah.
So it's a well-known European wildflower. And yes, it can be weedy, but I find it seriously useful in difficult spots in the garden, just to give me that good evergreen strappy foliage.
But talking of evergreen,
yes.
Is there not a variegated form? You know my passion for variegation.
Well, I have to say the variegated one is slower, weaker growing, rarely flowers, so therefore hardly will
You're
ever...
really selling it.
Yeah, but it does have stripy variegated leaves, which can be useful in shade because it can bring a little bit of light and colour into shade.
True.
Yeah, the variegated form is an interesting addition to the garden. For those who are a bit scared of the green leaf form taking off, maybe the variegated one is the one for you.
Okay, well, I think we've got one other thing to go and look at.
Yes, we have. So let's go and have a look at that as well.
Okay. More squatting in the dappled light, Stephen.
Yes, we're down on our knees yet again. This plant, the final one of our series of plants for the shade, has quite large, coarse leaves. Well, it's a bit late now, you have.
Quite big, look at that, huge.
Yes, big coarse leaves on it. So some people might say, oh, it's a little bit sort of rough and ready looking for the better parts of the garden. But it's a plant called Trachystemon orientali, commonly known as Russian borage.
Yeah.
And it is in the Boraginaceae family, of course. And it gets, I'm going to do some picking as well, it gets these rather handsome tiny blue flowers that look just like borage.
Yeah,
very pretty. You can see the family resemblance. And it does tend to die down a little bit in the late autumn, But as soon as you start getting some cold winter rains and things, it starts to pop up again. Flowers in the late winter, so it makes it a very good plant for pollinating insects.
Yeah.
So you'll attract all of the early bees and other hoverflies and things. And the leaves get up even bigger than what they look like now. So by late spring, this will have leaves that will make the average hosta a little bit embarrassed.
Aha.
And it's rough to the touch. The slugs and snails seem to leave it alone. It spreads by a creeping rhizome, which is quite thick.
Yeah.
And also I find in my garden, I get the occasional self-sown seedling coming up. And just as an aside, being in the Boraginaceae family, we should all have things like Russian borage, comfrey, borage and things in the garden, not only because they can be useful in cooking and other sundry things, but the leaves of any of these plants are great compost accelerators.
Oh.
So pick the leaves, throw them in your compost heap, and it will help accelerate the rotting down process of your compost. So there you go, it's a useful plant as well.
Well, there you go. Now, where's this from?
Well, they call it Russian borage, but it actually comes from the Caucasus, Turkey, all through that sort of central northern European area. So it will grow anywhere in the colder climates. You'll grow it in Canada, you'll grow it in Finland, you'll grow it in almost any of the colder climates. And again, apart from tropical climates, it would grow in most Mediterranean areas in the shade with just a modicum of moisture.
Right, I was going to say. Yeah. Well, that is absolutely beautiful. Well, I've loved this crawling through the undergrowth.
I'm not so sure my back has, but anyhow, we'll do some taller plants next time.
I was going to say, so where are we going to stand up next week, Stephen?
Yes, well, it'll be somewhere where we're talking about something up in the air a bit for a change.
Well, there you go. Now, if you want to know where we're squatting next week, do hit subscribe. We post every week on a Friday.
And don't forget that we do our Monday shorts.
Yes.
So if you've got a horticultural question you'd like to ask me, which I can answer in 60 seconds, I'm very happy to do that. But do remember to put where you're from so that I've got context.
There you go. So we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.